Hello, thank you for watching. Welcome to another interview with one of the authors of Wonders and Dragons, a Midwest fantasy sampler. Tonight we're talking to Kirsten Solberg, author of the Palomar Saga and the short story The Apothecary's Assistant. Hello, Kirsten.
Hey, how are you?
Really good. So you're working on a Flintlock fantasy saga. Tell me about the series. How many books are in it? How
hmm
many will be in it when it's finished? And what's your kind of timeline and expectation for that?
Yeah, so right now, the Palomar Saga has two full-length novels, books one and two, and a prequel novella, and obviously a short story now that takes place in the world. And it is going to be a five-book series, like the full novels will be five. There may or may not be some uh, intermittent novellas that happen, but given the breadth of these projects, probably not. But that is the plan right now. It did originally a long time ago start as maybe a trilogy and then it became four, and now it is five that are very tightly outlined. So that's where it's going to stay.
That's been a trend with people I've spoken to. Well, it started out as a duology. Well, it
Yep,
started out
yep.
as a trilogy. Here's my 17 book series of the Wheel of
Yeah, I
Time.
promise I will not go 17 books, at least in this series.
Gotcha. So, what's the overall plot of your series? Tell me a bit about kind of like the story structure, some of the main characters.
So, this story takes place in a world where some people have discovered immortality. 1200 years before the story opens is when that happened, and things have not gone well. They are trapped in their, flawed mortal bodies, and they were meant to age and die, and they haven't, so they've gone insane over time. So the plot revolves around a family of smugglers who wants nothing to do with these people getting wrapped up into a manhunt when one of the immortals was killed.
So, I've read your first book, or rather, I listened to an ARC copy of it. How does this short story relate to the main series? I assume it's a prequel, judging by context, but how does it fit into kind of the timeline and structure of your other books?
Yeah. So Remnant opens about 6 or so years after the short story. And then there's a time skip later in Remnant that goes another 5 years forward. So, really, for the main story, it's about 11 years previous. And it is told from the perspective of one of the characters whose perspective the Palomar saga is not told from. So, she is a supporting character and not a point of view character there. So it ties in some of the things that were going on that pushed this family to live the way that they did and to have to separate a little bit before the opening of Remnant. So it starts to delve into that story without like going full force because you didn't want a novel, you wanted a short story.
Well, I appreciate your restraint. So, obviously, the main characters in this story are a family,
Yep.
and those are some of the same main characters that are going to be there throughout the whole story. How important is family to your writing? Is it something that you consciously set out with an idea of making themes around? Was it just a natural vehicle for who the characters in your stories would be? Or is there particular meaning behind that particular commentary you wanted to have? It seems to be like there's some rather interesting ties between the
Yeah.
blended family of the child from the previous marriage and the step
Mhm.
siblings. It seems like there's a lot of relationships there that you're looking to explore in certain ways. So, how does that impact your writing?
Yeah, we did actually set out initially to write an epic fantasy that revolved around an entire nuclear family. And it didn't have to be necessarily just a biological family, which is why there's some of the blended aspects to it. But that was one of the main things that we set out to do because it wasn't something we saw a lot of. There are obviously everybody in a story has a family, but often it's, orphan goes and saves the world, which are great stories. Or, somebody with really crappy family origins leaves and does something, or they have a good family that they leave to try to protect. And we wanted to explore what would it look like if they all went out and did the thing.
And that's something I enjoy seeing. Like, I also had a similar instinct for my first book that I wanted to create relationships that were realistic but had a real warmth to them. I wanted to show a family that had dynamics worth aspiring to rather than merely being triggers for the development of the characters. Rather than
Mm.
having family be either lost as an emotional drive or abusive as an emotional drive
Mm-hmm.
or distant or cold as an emotional drive. I wanted to show kind of that family is usually ingrained in most people's lives and integral. And so I wanted to make sure that those ties stayed throughout the story. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why my main series also has, a familial unit as the primary characters throughout. I really like seeing that in your work.
Mm-hmm.
You work with as one half of a writing duo with your
Yep.
mother, Carol Jacobson. And what was that like? How do you guys divide the labor? Is one of you more creative, one of you more editorial? Do
Mm.
you both enjoy this? Was one of you dragged into it kicking and screaming by the other one saying, come on, this will be fun? How is that? What does that structure look like?
Yeah. So the way that we operate now, I'm definitely the originator, the drafter, and she is very editorial. She's a very, very, very hands-on, in-depth developmental editor, essentially, and really helps to guide the story. Our joke is that if we're up to my mom, she never would have started. And if we're up to me, I never would have finished. And together we are one functioning author. So, and that's how we function as that one author, is that we're really an almost like an editorial publishing team. And obviously we're indie, so we kind of have to operate like that anyway. But even before we decided to go indie, that's how we were operating. So the initial draft was a little bit more collaborative. And I was also 15, so I had no idea what I was doing. But as things progressed and as the world building became way more complex and the characters became more numerous and more complex, it's difficult for two people to write that like original draft. Because even when I outline, and I am very detailed in my outlines, I can't put everything on there so that somebody else could necessarily like take it and like write it. So that's just how we function. I know there's a lot of different ways to do. There's no wrong way to do co-authorship as long as you're both alive at the end of the process and you're proud of your work.
Yeah. Yeah, and so is she involved then in the planning stages very heavily,
Yep.
like the original outlines, or is that more so your side?
Yeah. So we talk about our plans and the direction that the books are going pretty often at every single stage. So I will make insane voice notes to myself late at night because that's when my creativity pops off. So I'll get out of bed at 3 a.m. and I'll go make a voice note. It
Sounds
does sound
very
insane
familiar.
when I listen to it in the morning. And I'm sure if for some reason I get famous, they'll be in a museum someday and right along with my like psychological rap sheet, and there'll be little strings. But I will talk to her about those and then we'll make we'll both be making notes in whatever exists of that manuscript at the time. Sometimes it is literally just notes, and sometimes there's some drafted and there's some chapters that are just outlined, or there's just like a beat sheet essentially, and we'll both be making notes about that and talking back and forth. And now because I sent you the file that wasn't scrubbed of all our comments, how like ruthlessly snarky we are with each other in
It
those
wasn't that
comments
bad, but
and
there
notes.
was some detectable snark, yes. I was
Yeah,
very amused by that. I got it and started looking through. I was like, oh, I feel like a fly on the wall to your creative process here. So you
yeah,
said you started at 15 with the rough draft of your first one. So clearly
yeah.
this series has been with you for a while. You've been working on this, steeped in it for a while. What was the final impetus to call one done and release it out into the world?
Um, I think to get there, I almost have to start at the beginning. So um, we are have both been super creative people. My mom wrote her master's thesis on Tom Bombadil, so she is a certified nerd.
Yes.
Um, yeah, like we grew up with my dad reading like The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion as our bedtime stories. Like they are both super duper fantasy nerds.
Peak
And
childhood.
I obviously was very encouraged to explore those things. And although I had dyslexia, and in the 90s, they didn't treat dyslexia very effectively. So it took me a while to really love reading. I was about 14 before I really started loving reading. And as many kids of my generation, it happened with Harry Potter. And so then I started writing what I didn't know at the time is essentially fan fiction of Harry Potter and like a spiral bound notebook, but I was also getting like detentions for it because I wasn't paying attention in class and I was like not handing in homework. And my
This is the
mom was
best way
very
to get
annoyed.
detentions, though.
Yeah, she was super annoyed. So she eventually was like, hey, maybe instead of you writing in that notebook and failing classes, like, I don't know, the language you speak, why don't we write together and then we'll just write when it's appropriate to write. And she told me her premise about, you know, uh, a fantasy novel, a fantasy story that revolves around like an entire family who all really do right by each other. And the world is, they're kind of like them against the world. And also this premise of like, what if it was a world in which they couldn't use fire for whatever reason and they had these little rocks that would absorb heat and light from the sun. Those were her like to throw out their premises. And I was like, okay, that sounds really interesting, especially the fire part. And I was like, can the family be a crime family? And my mom looks at me and she's like, okay, fine. Um, at this point,
For concession to your
yeah, we were struggling to get along, as is common of a mother and a 15-year-old girl. And this was kind of her last ditch effort to like get through to me and get me to be responsible and but without stifling my creativity, which I'm eternally grateful for. So we started writing together. I still got detentions even from writing this. And um we wrote it, we worked on it. We didn't really know what it was, and we were just having fun. And it really spearheaded repairing our relationship and understanding of one another, which was kind of the point at the beginning. And then we finished it when I was in college at some point and put it away and thought, oh, that was fun. Like we went to one writing conference, we had an editor look at it and he was like, yeah, it's a nice story. And that, but nobody's going to publish it if you don't have the series developed, which we didn't. We had no idea what we were doing. So we put it away. And I became a mother later in my 20s. And in that, I realized I needed some kind of creative outlet. So I picked it up again and I reread it and I was like, barf, I hate this. So and I had also just read Brian McClellan's Powder Mage trilogy. And I didn't know Flintlock fantasy was even a thing. I didn't know that was an option. I thought it was like Tolkien and like, you know, Dresden Files. Like those were the two types of fantasy. Both are great. I just didn't, and which is silly because I'm like, I knew steampunk was sort of thing, but I didn't want to do steampunk. So that totally like got me going on rewriting. And so it kind of became this whole other thing where the characters were still intact for the most part. And some of the plot was sort of intact, but everything else is like super duper different. Um, and that's when I brought it to my mom and I was like, hey, remember that book that we wrote? I rewrote it. And she's like, you did what? She
How
did not
dare.
like it at first. When she first started reading the rewrite, she's like, I hate this. And I was like, okay, keep reading. At that point, I had thicker skin. She had told me that at 20, I might have melted. And she read it further and she was like, okay, I think I get it. I think this is something that we could really do. So we started rewriting it seriously. We got an editor to help us. And at that point, we're like, we think this is worthy of being read by the public. So then we started querying, and that's a whole thing. I'm glad we did it. I learned a lot. But then I did come to the conclusion after getting a lot of very nice form rejections and then some other more interest. But then ultimately, like, yeah, it's a great story. It's way too much for a debut author for us to market. And I was like, well, you told me it was shelf worthy, but not for a new author. I don't, okay. So I was like, screw it. We're just going to do this ourselves.
You mentioned a few things about the magic in your world, though, or
Yeah.
not the magic, but the world building of your world. The
Yeah.
firestones and the absence of standard fire and things. Why don't
Mhm.
you delve into that a little bit more and kind of
Yeah.
describe what makes your world unique? There's the shade binding, and then there's the setting in the gunpowder age. Tell me a little
Yeah.
bit about kind of just the general setup.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier that there are these immortals who have been around for a while and they're slowly losing their sanity. Well, many of them have lost their sanity in that they now do truly believe that they are either divinely appointed or are divine and have kind of co opted like the local religious structures in order to keep and expand their powers, like their political and economic influence and control. And one of the things that they have done out of that is to outlaw the use of fire. But there are these rocks that absorb the heat and
Anti-Prometheus.
sun. Yeah. So it is so there is an alternative that already existed, even though it's not always logistically or economically practical. They have made it a requirement. And that's part of the way that they control the economic and cultural space over which they have dominion. So there's nothing wrong with fire. They just pretend that there is, and they have baked it now into the populace for the last 700 years. So, yeah. So that's how that part works. And it's very motivated by power. Obviously, then there's this concept of shades, which aren't shades in the classic sense of like a ghost. They are just this incorporeal, almost animal entity that becomes, it comes into existence from a dead body, but they're not like a soul of a person, although there are like varying beliefs on what exactly they are and how intelligent they are and how malevolent they are and all that. And
You have
so,
plans for like exploring that down the road, or is that just kind
yeah,
of like
so
a haze
there,
of mystery that stays throughout?
no, that is going to actually, there are things that are going to be explored about that as the series progresses. And I don't want to spoil it, so I'm not going
Oh
to
no,
say
I'm not
much
asking for
about that.
spoilers.
Yeah. But yeah, the nature of those entities and their, are they good or evil? What exactly are they? Where do they come from? What are they made of? Is something that is explored as the series goes on, particularly in the later books. So those play a big role also in how this regime of immortals came to power, because they they had a lot of war in the past, and so a lot of people died, and there's a lot of shades running around, and they are dangerous in certain circumstances. So then problem they created, classic politician, like, oh look, I can solve that problem. Let's not talk about the fact that I made it. You know,
Sounds very familiar.
yeah.
Nice. And so what are some of the races in your world and how do they kind of like play into the overall structure? Because I know there's clearly a few different races. You've got your
Yep.
winged race and the is it troll, I believe was the
Mm-hmm.
word you used for like Shane's
Yeah.
race. How do
Yeah.
these different peoples play into the structure of
Yeah.
your world?
Yeah. So there's obviously humans, and that's kind of where you start in the perspective. Even the villain character, whose perspective you walk through in the book, is a human. And then the family of smugglers are human, but they do have other races of people that they've kind of adopted into their fold, including Shane. But so they're one of the main sapien races. I've called them sapien because it's a term that people can like readily recognize, even though I'm like altering the use from like the scientific use a little bit. It's something
Yeah,
that worked and people could just
it
like pick up.
works. Yep.
And it's something that's always bothered me about a lot of fantasy worlds in which there are multiple different types of like humanoid species, is that they don't have like one unifying identity. And sometimes that's on purpose because that's baked into their conflict. But in this one, I wanted them to have more of that like unifying, like, how we say we're all human, but some of us are like Irish and some of us are like Chinese, like we have different ethnic backgrounds, and sometimes that comes with different like physical characteristics. We're
Yeah.
still all one thing. And I wanted
It's a
there to be a sense of that, yeah, in the book.
Yeah,
So
it's a trick that a lot of people have to come over. In my own books, I call all the sentient races souls,
yeah,
basically,
yeah.
but it is clunky. It does not always work, and I often have to kind of intentionally structure the way I make references to them to make that
Mhm.
flow smoothly. And I
Yeah,
don't like the fact that I don't have an established word like you're talking about to
yeah,
unify all the
yep,
sentient races as a perceived separate tier from, say,
Well,
animals or spirits. So that's
yeah,
super helpful.
yeah. So I'm happy to start a trend. I don't own the word, go for it. But so there's humans, and then the closest people geographically to them would be Fae. And they are, Fae are very popular right now. And I did not know that when I started this book, and not much of that has changed since I started this book. So I was kind of like, huh, isn't that interesting? And they're not, they're not immortal. They do live longer than humans by like, 2 centuries or something. And they do have different magical propensities. Each of the races has their own relationship with magic that's unique to their own race. And then you have trolls and goblins, and they also, to refer to themselves in their own native languages, they use the terms thirst for trolls and kobold for goblins. And those are actually really old Norse words for those things. So I was kind of borrowing from that cultural history to give it a little bit more depth than just like, I don't know. And then you have this completely made up race that I've never found anywhere really, that I call Tarian. And they are the people who can conjure essentially dragon wings. So they shapeshift a little bit like the Fae. Some of the Fae can, but it's a little bit different. They're not shifting into a completely different form like an animal. They have an appendage that's hidden or not hidden, essentially. But they also have the longest lifespans. They're more like 400 years, and they have a magic characteristic that all of their race has to some degree. Um, that's called Mindcraft, that some humans can have, but it's mostly unique to them, and theirs is quite a bit more powerful. So those are kind of the different races of this world.
Gotcha. And so do you have a any kind of mythology behind the origin for these different
Yeah.
races and your world, or is that
Yeah.
kind of left more to the side?
I have it. It's not always directly on page, but there's a lot of like little Easter egg references to it. And for my fellow super nerd readers, there's more in the appendices in the back of the books.
Here we
But
are, Tolkien.
essentially, yeah, and it is talked about a little bit on page in some of the places in the story. It's generally believed in this world that Tarian were the original sapien species to inhabit this world, but that they were more closely related to dragons at the time. And dragons have become something of a myth. They do like there's like recorded um instances of them being around, and there's lots of mythology and legend about them. There's even like some, you know, like skeletal remains, like fossils and things. But for the most part, they don't know of any existing in the day that this story takes place. But their mythology and their worldview is baked into that a little bit. And then there's these almost universal myths around this planet that these other races came from somewhere else, and it's very vague. But a lot of it has to do with the world gates, which are these like teleportation devices that are peppered all throughout the world.
Gotcha. Yeah, there's only two kinds of fantasy. Once the world was richer and more magical and full of dragons, is the
Mm-hmm.
first. And the second is, okay, how the heck do we get rid of all these dragons? They're killing everybody.
Exactly. Yeah,
So
yeah.
clearly yours is the first one.
Yeah. And there probably was a story somewhere back in the timeline where they're like, they gotta go. Maybe
Exactly.
I'll
Yeah.
write that one day.
It's a cycle.
Yeah.
So how do you have a certain purpose behind each of your races as far as like I know when I wrote mine, I
Mhm.
based each one on a god that represented a different trait. And so it was useful for me to have like a quick shortcut to access some themes because there
Yeah.
was a certain expectation baked into each race.
Yeah.
Do you have anything similar in your writing where it's like, okay, I can use the certain attributes that are expected in this race
Mm,
to do certain things thematically or storyline wise?
yeah. Um, it's nothing so explicit as that. It's more the themes are pretty subtle. Um, the Fae are a little bit more like connected to nature because of the literal nature of the magic that they possess. Like they can either influence elements or like plants or animals, or they can like shape shift into those things. And some can do, very rarely can they do both. So they're very connected to those types of like things. They're very in tune with like nature and the balance of like what we need as a society to thrive, but also making sure that we're not like destroying the world in the process of pursuing our own prosperity. Um, and then the Tarian are very dialed into like they're very intellectual, they're very stoic because their minds are kind of open to each other. You can't hide a lot. So honesty is hugely baked into their culture. So anything having to do with like the connectedness of your mind and your thoughts, there that's a very huge theme for them. And then like trolls and goblins are a little bit more subtle. I mean, they're very strong, so they have a very like they all have like a very warrior embedded culture. Um, but I also have always felt kind of bad for the orcs. Like after everything goes down in Return of the King, I'm like, okay, so your guy's gone and you were being controlled the whole time, and like, okay, now you're just gonna be like erased. That
They were bad
sucks.
guys.
I mean, yeah, and I do. I like. I've read all the things. I understand, but also, to some degree, I'm like, they had no agency. What if they did? What would they like? What could they choose good if they were given the chance? And I've always wondered about that because, especially because you can't really separate Tolkien's like Catholicism and his theology from his works, is like what of our choices do we have in being a fallen people versus like a redeemed people? So like I don't know if I'm being really intellectually and theologically honest, aren't we also the orcs? So,
I mean,
you
yeah,
know, like um so I always thought, okay, what if they were that at one point and like they became their own culture? Like what would that look like? So the goblins and the trolls are a little bit of that, like that's baked into their history a little bit. And then the humans obviously are a little bit more in this story. They're very much the ones under the control of these immortals who have made themselves gods, and they're very self deceived. So it's kind of like a metaphor of how we struggle to define and understand and even look truth in the face on a regular basis in our culture. So,
that's cool. Yeah, it's always interesting to see the discussions about Tolkien's orcs
yeah,
because if you try to place them too closely in the context of, you know, the real world, they definitely do fall apart.
yeah,
Like it doesn't function as a parallel to what's in this world
yep,
on a one-to-one basis. Like
mm-hmm,
if you were to say, okay, so the orcs represent whoever the bad guys are in whatever
mm-hmm.
particular war or geopolitical position you want to put them in or anything like that, it
Yeah,
falls apart because they're inherently dark and that's not how the world operates. But
yeah,
I think in the personal experience of individuals, we all
mm-hmm,
have, in our own life, things that are the darkness to us, things that are
yeah,
the thing that we have to overcome and struggle against in our life that might very well be completely irredeemable and bad.
yeah,
And in that lens, I think it works so much better. Like when you reduce them to a parallel not for geopolitics or people, but
mm-hmm,
as a
yeah,
parallel for the human experience, I think it really
yes.
works.
And that
So,
was
I mean, I'm
definitely
wearing a
his.
Gray Haven shirt right now.
There you
I
go. There
gotta
you
support my
go.
boy. I gotta support my boy.
Yeah. Well, and his anything that he was talking about metaphorically in his books that was specific to the world that he was living at the time was probably more of a commentary on how we were treating the world that we live in. Like he was very much like a conservationist in a time where that was
Oh,
not very
hugely.
popular.
Yeah.
So the ents were there for that.
Yes. Like you read any comment he ever makes about machinery, and you can
Hmm.
just about like
Oh
feel the
yeah,
venom
that's
coming out
I
of
mean,
him.
there's a reason that Isengard was an industrial complex.
Hmm. Yeah, like him and if you read to like just some of the records of him and Lewis's conversations, like the frustration he had with every form of mechanization was very
Hmm.
interesting because it came so early.
Yeah.
Like he lived right around the time when it was first tipping over
Yeah.
into the heavy industrialization that we see nowadays. But
Yeah.
he only saw like the forerunner of it. I think if he
Yeah.
saw what came 30 or 40 years later,
He'd
would have
fall out
just
of his chair.
broken him. Yeah.
Yeah.
But so in your writing, you've got all these characters. Who is your favorite and why is it Shane?
We know who your favorite is. Um, who is my I think my favorite is actually Rose. And if you read book two, you'll start to see the glimmer. I mean, I think there's glimmers also in book one. She's not a
I'm
huge
afraid I haven't
part
gotten
of
to
book
two yet.
one. Yeah, no, that's okay. She's not a huge part of book one, but she was not supposed to make it. She was not there. She was there to like push, to be the sacrificial lamb for pushing Ella's narrative forward. And she just like survived. And I was like, well, what now? Um, so and this was early on in the rewrite where I had to like go back and be like, okay, but what is your story here then? Because I feel like every character on the page who's going to have that much of an impact on the story has to have like an entire backstory, an entire future trajectory. And she has surprised me at every single turn. She starts out as this little brat that you just want to punch in the face. And even Ella, the nicest woman on the face of the earth, wants to punch her in the face. And she goes through pretty incredible character development in very succinct little episodes that you don't, because you're not seeing that part from her perspective. You do get her later on in the book. Um, but Ella sees it, and Ella is even kind of surprised by it, which was intentional in the beginning, but then she was supposed to like, so she's around. I got to do something with
Kind
her.
of like Dwight in Walking Dead, where like, yeah, we'll have this guy around for one season and then he becomes like the most beloved character
Oh
for the
yeah,
whole show and then gets
absolutely.
his
And
own spin-off.
I know that that's true about Rose because beta readers for book two were like, I want more, and I was like, don't worry, it's coming. So she has become a force of nature in this narrative that I was not anticipating. And I love her character growth that she starts out as if not despicable, at least easily despised. Like, okay, you're a little brat, you've lived a life of privilege and you want everybody to know that you deserved it. And 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 she goes through some pretty rough stuff, and she grows and leans into it, even though yeah, she does complain a lot along the way. So
Yeah.
I feel like she is a representation of how a lot of, if we were really thrown into a world like that, living lives that we live in the incredible comfort in which we exist in 2025, talking online, sitting in our warm houses like that, we would be a little bit of Rose at the beginning.
Yeah, no, I would be whining the whole way
Oh
from
yeah,
Hobbiton to Mordor,
absolutely.
screaming for
Yeah.
my comfortable little hobbit hole and
Yep.
my,
And yeah.
niceties.
Yeah, she rises to the challenge, and she doesn't forget where she comes from, and she doesn't lose her pre-existing strengths in the process. Like she will tell you exactly what she thinks, and she'll tell it in the rudest way possible.
That's a good answer. I look forward to seeing more of her in book two then. What do you consider the strongest element in this series? So if people are looking for a series to read,
Yep.
why should they read Palomar Saga? Is it your prose, your
Mhm.
characters, your plot?
Yeah. It is really character driven. I think that is the pillar. Like if I had to put them on like, first place, second place, third place, that characters are super vivid, super well developed. Um, so that would be the one. I do think that the world building and plot intricacies are not far behind it, but but if I had to pick one, it would be characters.
And so you created an audiobook for this, and
Yeah.
you worked with Michael Kramer and Kat Redding, which the first thing I ever saw about you as an author was I saw you were looking for ARC readers for your
Yeah.
audiobook, and you had the narrators posted. And that's honestly kind of what drew me to it. I was just like, wow, this
Yeah.
is an indie author who
Yep.
went so far as to hire these, kind of top tier
Hmm.
talents. What was that like? What made you decide to seek out someone that established, and how
Yeah.
did it work out?
Um, I did it because I was insane and I didn't know what I was doing. But I don't regret it. I will say that first of all. I did not really hang around in like the indie author space before I was like ready to publish.
Me neither.
And I probably would have done things a little differently had I, but I'm actually glad that I didn't. Um, for one, it was a privilege to be able to do that. Like I co-write with my mom, so we did split the cost, and I did have some time to save up for it. Um, it was very expensive, and they were worth every penny, absolutely. And I did get a lot of sales because their names were on it, and that does seem to kind of continue a little bit. Like you can't just auto market though; that's not a thing. So I probably had higher expectations of how that would pop off just having their names on it than it actually went, but it did go really well, especially like the first, month or two. Um, I am greatly privileged that they read my entire manuscript before agreeing and were like, we love it. We'll do it. That gave me a ton of confidence that I don't think I would have otherwise had. Um, and now being more than 1 year out from publication, having a bit of critical feedback under my belt from like readers and reviewers and whatnot, I do think that my confidence in the story after they read it was well placed. And I don't know that I would have gotten there that fast had they not been on board. So for that reason alone, I think it was worth it.
Nice.
But this is coming from a place of incredible privilege because I had another business I was running at the time that was doing really well, but I was like stepping away from it. So I had quite a bit of, you know, FU money, if you will, to like work with that, which is never something I've had in my life before. So that was really cool to be able to celebrate that by getting something that was kind of a bucket list item. I'm probably not going to be able to afford them for future books, like in the near future. Um, if I want to like continue to put work out to the quality that I'm putting it out, the production value of everything else at the speed that I want, because I'd have to wait another like 3 years to save up the
Yeah.
money.
Yeah.
So, that in that regard, I'm like, oh, it's kind of annoying that I can't do the same ones for every book. But at the same time, I'm really glad I did it. And also, they are consummate professionals and they are amazing to work with. They are super passionate about what they do, about the quality of their work. And I learned how to write things out phonetically. Didn't know how to do that before.
Yeah, that was interesting. When I did my own audio, figuring out how to like just as make sure everything was consistent across
Yeah.
the different because mine was full cast. So like trying to figure out how to make
Yeah.
everything consistent across all the narrators was
Yeah.
fun. Eventually I just created like a whole list of single audio files for every single fantasy word. And I
Yeah.
just like posted
And
that
that
to
and
the
that's a way
audition
to do it
forum.
too. And I think what I did was I had a short list that I did record and then I listed them all out in order and spelled them the way that Kate had taught me how to do it. So
Gotcha.
yeah.
Nice. So what do you have planned after the Palomar saga? So you said you had all five books pretty thoroughly plotted out, some
Yep.
of them partially or even mostly written. What do you plan afterwards? Do you want to stay in this world? Do you want to hop
Mhm.
through one of your world gates to the world the humans came from, or do you want to do something
Ooh,
totally,
you caught
totally
on to
different?
that. I do have another series planned and even partly plotted and outlined already. And it does involve those world gates. Those because
Nice.
yeah, those in the be and this isn't super spoilery because it's like the first three chapters or something, is that the grandfather tells the children of this smuggler family the story about how when the Wraith Gates used to be something else and he called them world gates and blah blah blah, and that's also baked into the mythology of this place. And so that is kind of a jumping off point for this other series that I'm going to be doing, and there may or may not be some familiar faces.
So I am expecting to see a tall, gray-haired man in fatigues and a short, blonde-haired woman in fatigues, both with P90s, and followed by another fellow in round glasses. Is that what you mean by familiar faces?
Yeah, no, I did have to like make some really conscientious decisions to be like, man, I am straying toward like Stargate territory here. We got to be real careful.
I'm glad.
But
I'm
you know,
glad. I'm glad the reference was
there's
caught.
nothing new under the sun. Yeah.
Yeah. If you hadn't watched Stargate, I feel like that could have been sounded just very random. But
I'm glad that I have been very familiar with that, like that whole, lore and franchise, because I would have probably unconsciously steered into it too far and then had to like
mhm.
figure stuff out. There's a
Yep.
certain degree of market research that I think is good, but you don't have to like read everything everywhere. You'll never write a thing in your life.
Exactly. It's like there's nothing new under the sun,
Yep.
but everything can have a new spin.
Yep.
And you just got to figure out, okay, I'm not consciously stealing here. So there's
Yep.
that. But
Yep.
have I veered too close to something that already exists? Maybe. So maybe I'll just tweak it into this direction to differentiate. And you just kind
Yeah.
of navigate those waters of making it as yours as possible, but without
Yeah.
so deeply like self-analyzing that you realize I can't even write these words because they're in the same language that other people are using.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Tolkien. Uh,
Nice. And the last question I've been asking everybody is,
mhm.
are there any series or authors or stories that when you read first inspired you to want to write? I know you touched on earlier, you kind of started reading a lot a little later, like pretty close actually to when you started writing. And it
Yeah.
was largely, your family that influenced you to begin the writing. But were there any authors or a series also that kind of played a part in that?
Hmm. In writing this story, I can't really think of a specific one at its inception, because to be fully honest, I wasn't terribly well read when I started writing this. And if you ever read the first draft, which you will not, I'm going to burn it. It will show. But I did have a pretty good appreciation for like world mythology. So not specifically like fantasy books, but just like a general knowledge of and interest in like how mythology and folk tales like evolve, in the world. I had read Joseph Campbell's A Hero with a Thousand Faces
My favorite books.
pretty close to when I really seriously was sitting down with my mom at like 16 or 17 to like, what is this book really going to be? And even then, we didn't know what we were doing, but that book absolutely filled my soul. And I read a bunch of like mythological accounts after that. Like I read Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. I read a bunch of I read a bunch of like Grimm's fairy tales, a lot of those types of things. But I think it wasn't until he was maybe 20 when I read Mistborn, that I was like, okay, I can really like, because I had always wanted to get into the weeds of like the underworld of this story, and into the like the conspiratorial political machinations of the villains. I hadn't really done that in the first draft. And that book inspired me to think more about those things and to weave them, and like it gave me a structure on like how to weave them in. um and what I ended up doing was way beyond what like Mistborn ever touches on, but it's also a YA. And then people, oh, you got to read Way of Kings, and I was like, I think that might be too close. I'm not going to touch that. I actually just read it in like January, like of this year.
I think it was too close though. Like
No, no, but I do see that like he really delves into the like the political intrigue of things that are going on, while at the same time doing really deep character work. So I thought that was really cool to be like, okay, I see what you're doing. But I think it really was Brian McClellan's Powder Mage trilogy that like launched me into, okay, this is Flintlock. This is the world I want it. This is what's happening in the world. I'm basically plopping you into like, 6 months before the French Revolution pops off. Equivalency. You're not in that world, but you're in this other unique world. But things feel like that. It feels like something's going to go wrong, but there's also this like religious oligarchy of immortals, like the unkillable variety, hanging over everything. And then I think it was Joe Abercrombie's what is that called? The First Law trilogy that helped me to like hone in on the character voice of each person's point of view. So
Nice. Yeah, that's a good answer. I haven't read Abercrombie yet. I have the First Law trilogy is like the next thing on my TBR list.
okay,
Um, but so looking forward to that then. Thank you for
yeah,
doing the interview. It's
yeah.
always super fun to talk to you. You're one of the authors in here I've had the privilege of meeting before. You, your husband, you're lovely people.
In
So
real
thanks for
life,
talking.
yeah.
Thanks for being part of the project, and best of luck.
All right, thank you.